A widow, a shattered silence, and window panes that vanish without a trace. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It had been raining since before dawn, a steady, fine drizzle that made the air smell faintly of coal smoke and damp leaves. Maigret sat at his usual place in the kitchen, the one nearest the window, though the glass was misted over. He had not yet put on his heavy coat, only the cardigan his wife had knitted for him years ago, the elbows worn but still warm. Madame Maigret, behind him, was rinsing coffee cups, the rhythm of the water running over porcelain as steady as the rain. The telephone sat silent on the table. There were no pressing cases on his desk. He had not been to the Quai des Orfèvres since early the previous afternoon. It was the sort of morning that left him both content and faintly restless, like a dog not quite sure if it should lie down or wait by the door. He filled his pipe slowly, tamping the tobacco with his thumb. The first draw was unsatisfying, so he lit another match. Outside, the milkman's cart rolled over the wet cobblestones, the faint jingle of its harness bells fading into the murk. Somewhere upstairs in the building, a child was crying, the sound muffled by the floorboards. "You'll be late for your lunch," Madame Maigret said, without looking at him. She had a knack for reminding him of things without sounding as if she were reminding him at all. "I'm not expected anywhere," he answered, though he knew she meant he should go and get whatever it was out of his system, the subtle agitation she could always read on him. The postman came, his boots squeaking on the linoleum in the entryway. There was one letter, addressed to Maigret at home rather than the office, the handwriting uneven and large, the sort used by someone unused to correspondence. He slit it open with his thumbnail, a faint smell of damp paper rising as he unfolded it. It was brief. No name, no return address, just a few lines. "Inspector, I cannot sleep. I see it every night, the window panes all gone and her eyes looking out as if the glass was still there. Please come. Rue du Chevaleret, numero 14. He read it twice, then a third time, his pipe cooling between his fingers. The words were not alarming in the usual sense. There was no mention of murder, no accusation. Yet something in the phrasing, the window panes, the woman's eyes, pressed lightly but insistently on his mind. Madame Maigret glanced over. "Another one of your letters?" she asked gently. He didn't answer immediately. He folded the paper, slid it into his pocket and stood. "I'll be back for supper," he said, reaching for his coat. By the time he reached the street, the drizzle had turned to a thin, needling rain. Paris was muffled, its colors subdued, its people moving quickly under umbrellas. Maigret turned up his collar and set off toward the metro, not because the letter demanded urgency, but because something in it was like a splinter, not deep enough to wound, but impossible to ignore. At that moment, he had no clear sense of what awaited him in Rue du Chevaleret. Only the image the letter had planted, a bare window frame open to the rain, and a woman staring through it as if the missing glass were still there. The metro ride to Chevaleret was short and without incident, the sort of half-empty midday journey where faces were bland, tired, or fixed on nothing in particular. Maigret sat heavily, his hat brim casting a shadow over his eyes, the letter folded once more in his pocket like a talisman that somehow drew him forward. He wasn't in a hurry. His years had taught him that whatever waited at the other end of a journey would still be there, perhaps even more willing to speak, if he arrived without haste. The rain made everything appear grayer than it was. The walls of the station, the worn advertisements curling at the edges, the pale reflection of the electric light on the platform tiles. When he emerged onto Rue du Chevaleret, the smell of wet stone hit him first, followed by the faint odor of cabbage from a ground-floor kitchen. It was not a fashionable part of Paris. It belonged to shopkeepers, widows, and railway porters, People who lived in buildings where staircases groaned and the wallpaper had been faded by decades of weak sunlight. Number 14 stood between a shuttered bakery and a small ironmonger's with a window display of padlocks and enamel buckets. The building was narrow, its facade scarred by rain streaks, the kind of place where you could live for 30 years without anyone in another arrondissement knowing you existed. The front door gave onto a dim hallway that smelled of damp coats and coal dust. There was no concierge's lodge, only a rack for letters and a single bare bulb overhead. Maigret took off his hat and knocked on the door marked Rez-de-chaussée gauche. He waited. Inside, he heard a faint rustle, then the slow shuffle of slippers across a wooden floor. The woman who opened the door might have been anywhere between 60 and 70. Her hair, the color of unpolished pewter, was drawn back into a loose bun. She wore a thick cardigan over a faded dress, and in her right hand she clutched a damp handkerchief, though she made no move to use it. "You came," she said, as if that were the only introduction necessary. "You sent the letter?" She nodded and stepped aside without inviting him in so much as allowing him to cross the threshold. The flat was small, its furnishings heavy and old-fashioned. The air had a closeness that wasn't quite unpleasant, but spoke of windows rarely opened. "This way," she murmured, leading him through a short corridor to a front room. Maigret saw the window at once, or rather, he saw the absence. The frame was there, painted appealing, cream. But the panes themselves were gone. Rain blew in freely, speckling the worn rug beneath. Beyond, the street was visible, blurred by drizzle, and a tram rattled past. He stepped closer, feeling the cool breath of the weather on his cheek. When did this happen? The woman, he still didn't know her name, moved to stand beside him, but not too close. "A week ago. I woke one morning and they were gone. Not broken, not shattered, just gone. No glass on the floor. Nothing, not a splinter, as if they had never been there at all." Maigret turned to her, watching the fine movements of her face, the small tremor in her voice that didn't seem to come from cold. "Who lives here besides you?" "No one. My husband died 14 years ago. Since then, only me. Sometimes my sister visits, but she has her own place in Ivry." "And you haven't had workmen in?" "No." She hesitated, then added, "I told the police, the ones at the post around the corner. They said it must have been thieves. But what sort of thief takes only the glass?" It was a fair question. He let it sit in the air between them, resisting the urge to fill the silence. Outside, a man in a cap paused on the pavement to light a cigarette, glancing once up at the window before moving on. Maigret studied the frame. There was no sign of damage. The putty lines were smooth, unbroken. It was as if someone had lifted each pane out neatly, one by one, and spirited them away. "You watch the street much from here?" "Sometimes, in the evenings." Her eyes shifted, and for the first time she looked uneasy. "There's a boy. He sells newspapers at the corner. He stares up sometimes. I don't know why." "What's your name, madame?" "Villard. Elise Villard." She said it simply, without embellishment, as though the name were neither a shield nor a weapon, merely a fact. He asked if she had the letter she had sent him in her own handwriting, just to compare, but she shook her head. "I copied it out from something I wrote earlier. Then I burned the first one." That small act interested him, not because it was suspicious, though it might have been, but because it spoke of a certain deliberation. People who burned drafts often had more to hide in themselves than in the words. They sat at the table in her small kitchen, cups of coffee cooling between them. She had the air of someone who did not often entertain visitors. Her movements stiff, her conversation minimal. The silence was not awkward for Maigret. He was content to wait, to let her talk when she wished. After a while, she said, "It's not the window I mind. It's that I don't know who would do it or why. It makes you afraid of the air itself. When he left her, promising nothing, he stood for a moment on the pavement in front of number 14, watching the tram lines glisten in the wet street. He didn't head back to the metro at once. Instead, he walked to the corner she had mentioned. The boy selling papers was there, perhaps 16, his hair plastered to his forehead, his hands red with cold. "François, le Parisien," he called, with the automatic rhythm of someone who had said it thousands of times. Maigret bought a paper he didn't need. "You work here every day?" The boy shrugged. "Most days." His eyes were quick, wary. "You know the lady at number 14? Another shrug, this one more guarded. "She's old. She watches from the window sometimes." "Not lately," Maigret said. The boy gave him a look that was almost a challenge. "Number, not lately." It wasn't much, but Maigret had the impression the boy knew more than he was saying. Not necessarily about the missing panes, but about the life of this quiet street and the people who belonged, or didn't belong, to it. By the time he turned back toward the metro, the letter's strange image had deepened in his mind. It wasn't only the oddity of stolen glass, it was the way Madame Villard had spoken of it. Not as a nuisance or an inconvenience, but as if something intimate had been taken from her, something that had made her visible to the world and the world to her. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he hung his coat in the corner, letting it drip onto the tiled floor. Lucas was at his desk, reading reports. "Anything?" Maigret asked. Lucas shook his head. "Quiet day." Then, seeing the inspector's expression, he added, "Or maybe not for you." Maigret lit his pipe again, the smell of damp tobacco rising. "A woman in Rue du Chevaleret. Someone took the panes from her front window." Lucas blinked. "That's a crime?" Maigret didn't answer at once. He stared through the haze of smoke toward the rain-smeared window. "It's something," he said finally. "We'll see what it is." He was thinking of Madame Villard's thin hands wrapped around her coffee cup, of the boy's guarded glance, and of the street itself, which seemed to hold its breath under the steady drizzle. Some part of him knew he would be walking those wet pavements again before long. The rain kept on into the late afternoon, a steady curtain over the city. Maigret stayed at his desk, not because the paperwork in front of him mattered, but because his mind was still in Rue du Chevaleret. The quiet there, the smell of Madame Villard's flat, the way she had looked past him toward the empty window frame, all of it clung like the dampness on his coat. He turned the folded letter over in his hands again. Lucas had asked once more if it was worth the time, and Maigret had only given him a faint smile. Sometimes it wasn't the seriousness of the act that mattered, but the disturbance it left behind. He'd seen men kill with less intent than whoever had removed those panes, and yet leave a far smaller wound. At 5:30, he pushed back his chair. The boy at the corner had unsettled him in a way he hadn't shown. There was something closed in the boy's expression, not the simple caution of a stranger, but the kind that came from having seen something you weren't sure you should have seen. It was worth a second visit, though not tonight. Tonight he wanted to look at the street under different eyes. He took the metro back to Chevaleret, emerging just as the lamps were being lit. The street was darker now, the drizzle turning the pavement slick, and in the glow from the shop fronts the air seemed almost amber. Number 14 looked no different, but there was a light in Madame Villard's front room, visible through the empty frame of her window. A piece of old cloth had been draped across it now, billowing faintly in the damp air like a tired flag. Maigret didn't go in. Instead, he crossed to the bakery's recessed doorway, long since closed for the day, and leaned there, pipe in hand, watching the comings and goings. The ironmonger locked his door, tested it twice, and shuffled away under an umbrella. A woman in a blue raincoat paused near the tram stop, glancing once toward number 14 before boarding. Two men, neither young, argued in low voices as they passed, their shoulders hunched against the weather. He'd been there perhaps 20 minutes when a shadow moved across the lit cloth in Madame Villard's window. The figure paused. The outline was thin, a little stooped, and for a moment it looked as if she were peering straight into the street, though there was nothing to see but Maigret's own silhouette in the doorway. Then the shadow moved back, and the light dimmed. He walked away slowly, circling the block. From the side street he could see into the rear of the building. Narrow courtyards, clotheslines drooping under the rain, a single cat picking its way along a wall. He noted the rear stairwell windows, some lit, some dark, and a door that looked onto a back alley. If someone had wanted to remove glass without being seen from the street, that alley might have offered the cover. A voice behind him said, "You're not from here." He turned to find the boy again, though now he had no papers in his hands, only his cap pulled low and a bundle of something under his arm. "You're still out," Maigret said mildly. The boy's shoulders twitched in what might have been a shrug. "It's my corner. People notice when I'm gone." "Do they notice the lady's missing window panes?" The boy hesitated, shifting his weight. "People notice everything. They just don't always talk about it." Maigret nodded, as if that were the most natural answer in the world. "You saw something." "I didn't say that." "Number, you didn't." He paused, tamping his pipe. "If you ever do want to say it, you can find me at the Quai des Orfèvres." The boy glanced past him toward number 14, then back. "She doesn't sleep much. I see her light at 2 in the morning sometimes." Maigret let the remark stand without pressing. It was more than he'd had before. He left the boy there and made his way back to the station, the streets emptier now, the rain cold against his collar. That night, over dinner, Madame Maigret asked what had kept him so late. He told her, in outline, about the missing glass. She frowned, not in disbelief but in puzzlement. Perhaps she broke it herself and didn't want to admit it. Perhaps, he agreed. But the image of that intact frame, its putty lines unbroken, was too clear in his mind to accept it entirely. The next morning he went to the small police post near Rue de Chevaleret. The desk sergeant, a man with a walrus mustache and the slow manner of someone who didn't expect much to happen on his beat, remembered Madame Villard. "She came in early last week, said someone took her window panes. We went over, had a look, nothing much to see. We told her it was probably a prank." "And you left it at that?" The sergeant spread his hands. "No one saw anything. No one complained. What would you have us do?" Maigret didn't answer. He only thanked the man and left. Outside, the sky was brighter, though the air still smelled of last night's rain. He walked to number 14 again. Madame Villard opened the door more slowly this time, as if weighing whether to admit him. "I wanted another look," he said simply, and she stood aside. The cloth was still over the frame. He asked her to take it down for a moment. She did so without question, and the empty space gaped again, the street sound sharper without the filter of glass. "Do you often have visitors, madame?" "Not many. My sister sometimes. The grocer delivers if I'm unwell." "And at night? Any noises?" Her eyes flicked toward the window, then away. "Once or twice I've heard steps in the alley. But you hear many things at night, Inspector." He nodded, walking to the window and looking out. From this angle he could see the corner where the boy worked, the tram stop, the stretch of pavement opposite. Anyone removing glass here in daylight would have been seen, and yet no one had spoken of it. That meant it had likely been done under cover of darkness. But why take the trouble to do it so neatly? On his way out, he passed a neighbor on the stairs, a man in shirt sleeves carrying a basket of coal. The man glanced at him without greeting. "Do you know Madame Villard well?" Maigret asked, pausing. The man's lips thinned. "She keeps to herself." "That's not what I asked." A small shrug. "I've lived here 6 years. She was here before me. Quiet. Doesn't bother anyone. He shifted the basket and continued up without waiting for more questions. Back at the street, Maigret stopped at the ironmonger's. The shop smelled of oil and metal, and the owner, a wiry man with spectacles perched low on his nose, looked up from a tray of bolts. "You sell glass?" Maigret asked. "Some. Cut to size." "Anyone ask you to replace panes for number?" 14 recently." The ironmonger shook his head. "Number I'd remember. That house. People don't spend money if they can help it." It was another small confirmation. Whoever had taken the glass hadn't simply replaced it elsewhere in the building. The panes had gone entirely. By the time Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, he had more questions than answers, but they were the kind of questions that made him patient rather than impatient. There was something in the stillness of Rue du Chevaleret, in the guarded faces and the way people glanced, or didn't glance, at number 14 that told him the answer, when it came, would not be about glass at all. That evening, as the light drained from the sky, he thought again of the boy's remark, that Madame Villard's lamp burned at 2 in the morning. He imagined the bare frame, the open space where glass should be, and the woman sitting there in the dark, looking out at a street that thought it was watching her. The idea stayed with him long after he put his pipe down, like a photograph developing slowly in a dim room, the details not yet clear but inevitable in their approach. The following day began without weather, neither rain nor sun, a flat white sky that made Paris look as if it were holding its breath. Maigret was up early, sitting again at the kitchen table with his pipe unlit, the paper open at the police notices which, as usual, told him very little. Madame Maigret buttered a piece of toast and said, without turning from the counter, "If you mean to stare at that window again, take your scarf. A draught is honest enough, but it finds the throat of a man who stands still too long." It was the kind of remark that could have applied to any number of his habits, yet his mind fastened to one word: honest. A draught is honest, a pain is the polite lie between inside and outside. He thought of the old cloth in Madame Villard's frame, hung there like a modesty veil more for form than for warmth, and the way it had billowed when he watched from the bakery doorway. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he signed something he did not read, looked at the day's list, and pushed it aside. Lognon came in with his eternal air of having been personally wronged by the weather. "You're cheerful," he said, as if accusing him of a breach of discipline. "Is it true you're chasing after missing glass now? Next week it will be stolen curtains." He sat, uninvited, and dropped a folder on the desk. "There's a report about a rag-and-bone man making rounds earlier than usual near Chevaleret. If you're collecting trifles, add that." Maigret took the paper. A cart, bells muffled with cloth. Seen around 4 in the morning 2 nights prior, moving slowly through the back streets, no name on the side. The witness was no one. No one ever was in such reports. Only a man on his way to work, which meant a man used to seeing what others slept through. Early is when people choose. The company they prefer, Maigret murmured. Lognon gave a snort. "If you're going to wax philosophical about pains, I'm going to lunch." "Do," Maigret said mildly. When Lognon left, he tucked the notice into his pocket with the letter. The 2 pieces of paper were like flints. Held together, they might strike something. By late morning, he was back on Rue du Chevaleret. The boy was at his post, hawking headlines that no one on that street would buy for the headlines. Maigret bought another paper and didn't move away. After a moment, without looking at him, the boy said, "You came early." "So did a cart 2 nights ago." The boy's mouth thinned, then he called out, "François," to a woman who didn't stop. "Carts come early on lots of streets." "They muffle their bells on lots of streets." A pause. "Sometimes bells annoy people." He hesitated, then risked a glance. "If you stand there much longer, old Bousquet at the ironmonger's will charge you rent." "Let him," Maigret said. He failed to smile. The boy shifted his weight as if preparing to leave, and then didn't. "Does she talk to you, the lady?" "No," the boy said too quickly. "She doesn't talk to anyone." "Not at 2 in the morning?" The boy's eyes flicked, not toward the window, which would have been too obvious, but down the street toward the alley that ran behind the building. "I need to sell these," he muttered, and moved away along the curb, calling out with a diligence that convinced no one. It was not much, but it was enough to turn Maigret into the alley without announcing himself. The back of number 14 presented the same weary face as the front. A scabbed door, a drain pipe that had been mended with wire, the narrow panes of a stairwell window filmed with grime. He studied the ground. Last night's rain had left dark patches in the dust that told him nothing. He tried the back door. It was locked. From somewhere above came the faint sound of a radio turned low, then clicked off. On a sill near his shoulder, a trace of putty clung to a splinter of wood like a dull tear. He rubbed it between finger and thumb. It had the feel of something that had been softened, not newly, but with care, before a hand went to work. He went in at the front, and Madame Villard opened as if she had been standing just inside the door a while. Her eyes rested on his scarf, and something like gratitude moved and disappeared in her face, as if she recognized in it a concession to an intimacy she hadn't asked for. "Inspector," she said. She was better dressed than the day before. The cardigan buttoned properly, a clean collar, her hair drawn smoother. It had the look of someone who expected to be looked at. He asked to see the window again. She removed the cloth without prompting. The frame yawned, square and exact, the rails and stiles showing no violence. He ran a finger along the rebate where a pane would sit. The line was clean as a seam. "You kept things well," he said. "This frame is old and in good condition." "My husband made it," she said low. "He was a joiner before the war. He hated poor work." After a beat, she added, "He hated men who pretended poor work was all they could do." Would he have known how to take glass out without breaking it? "Anyone who puts things in well knows how to take them out," she said, and her gaze met his and slid away. He turned from the window. "Did you ever have a son, madame?" She didn't start. The answer had been waiting behind her lips for years. "No," she said. "I had hopes. It wasn't to be. Someone comes here at night." Her hands, which had been empty, seized the edge of the table. "You people," she murmured, not accusatory, almost respectful, as if acknowledging that this was the kind of thing they knew. "You stand and look until a thing gives itself a name." "I stand and look until a thing stops pretending," he corrected. He left it there, not pushing, and asked instead about the grocer, whether he delivered recently, whether she would mind if Lucas examined the frame later. She agreed more quickly than he'd expected. That was interesting too. People guilty of nothing refused more often than those guilty of something small and human. On the stairs, he met the coal man again, this time without his basket. "Still here," the man said. It was not warm. "Still here," Maigret agreed. "Does a cart pass your window at night?" "Aren't you from the police?" the man asked, head tilted. "You tell me." "Humor me." The man scratched his cheek. "There's always carts, milk, bread, junk. Times change, but things still move." He started up. "You hear more than you see," he tossed over his shoulder, "hearing more than seeing." The phrase lodged. He left the building and walked the block again, listening now to the way the street held sound. The hollow clap of a door closing, a tram's bell muted by the flat sky, a woman's heels crying briefly on the wet. Standing in front of the cloth-draped rectangle, he spoke a word softly and heard it come back to him from the frame, gentled by absence. If you wanted to speak with someone in that room without waking a house, you could stand on the pavement and the air would carry it through. If you wanted to pass a packet the size of a folded paper without opening a door. He spent part of the afternoon looking for the cart. He went 2 streets over to where a man with a face like a walnut sold old chairs and cracked wash basins under an awning. The man knew carts. "That one runs too early," he said when asked. "Belongs to the younger Jolivet, unless he sold it. His father drank. The son swears he doesn't. He comes sometimes with glass, sometimes with wire, sometimes with nothing but a cap pulled down as if he had something anyway." "Where does he keep what he collects?" The walnut, face split in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Where any of them keep anything, where someone like you will find it if you choose." He gave a corner, a warehouse with a roof that had not been mended in a season. Maigret found the place, but he didn't go in. He only stood by the large warehouse door and smelled the dust and old rain and listened to a sparrow trapped under the eaves. He did not need to find glass there, stacked like loot. He only needed to know that if someone wanted to make panes vanish as an idea, they could do so by giving them to a world that swallowed little things whole. He returned to the office to ask Lucas to do the untidy work of checking Jolivet and the addresses attached to him. When Lucas grumbled good-naturedly, Maigret said, "And tonight bring an old coat you don't mind spoiling. Stake out? A walk?" Back home, while he changed his shirt, Madame Maigret put a plate on the table and observed, "If a woman hangs a cloth where a proper pane should be, it is not only against the cold, it is so the neighbors do not learn the shape of her nights." He looked at her, and she pretended to be busy with the forks. "Eat," she said, "and take the other scarf. You always leave one somewhere." It was close to 1 when he and Lucas walked into Rue du Chevaleret from opposite ends, 2 men idling, each the most ordinary thing the street had at that hour. The sky had gone the deep, expectant black of a city night that has not decided yet whether to rain. A single lamp burned in the stairwell of number 14. The cloth hung, pale in the dark, at the window like a dull moon. They did not stand still. They drifted. Lucas took the side of the street with the shop fronts, peered as if deciding which tin of sardines a man without appetite might live on, and Maigret wandered toward the alley, counting the windows that held a sliver of light and those that had made their bargains with sleep. At 5 minutes past 2, the alley breathed. It was not a sound so much as the end of a sound, the scrape of a shoe finding where the brick jutted. Maigret leaned against the drain-pipe as if it were something he had been meaning to rest his back on all day. A figure slid along the wall, small, quick, a bundle under the arm. The cap was the same as in the day, but caps are like faces at that hour. The boy halted at the back door, did nothing to it, then, after a pause, retreated and went instead to the corner of the building where the stone throws a slim triangle of shadow. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and made no audible whistle. He didn't need sound. In the square of the front window, the cloth stirred. Across the street, Lucas had already turned so that his back was to the front of number 14. He seemed to be tying his shoe. A stepped rhythm came faintly through the open frame, not footsteps so much as the idea of steps. Maigret stayed where he was. The boy moved now to the pavement in front of their house and stood beneath the window, his face tipped up. Inside, a lamp came on, dim, shaded. The cloth lifted as though a sigh behind it had filled it. No words reached him, and yet there were words. The boy raised his bundle. A pale rectangle changed hands. No, did not change hands. It passed from the air of one life to the air of another, through the honest draught that takes what is asked of it. Then the cloth fell, the lamp went down to a glow, and the boy's shoulders, which had been rigid with purpose, loosened into the slump of a 16-year-old in the middle of a night that will still require him to be 16 in the morning. Lucas looked at him from his side of the street. Maigret shook his head slightly. Not yet. They let the boy go, moving with that peculiar carelessness that is born of getting away with something and not believing it matters. In the alley again, when the street had settled back into its slow breathing, Maigret counted to a number that meant nothing to anyone but him and walked to the front door of number 14. He didn't knock. He waited. The door opened before he raised his hand. Madame Villard stood in the hall, the lamp from her room pooling along the floorboards to his shoes. He tipped his hat back and said, "It is a cold night to be mending a window." Something in her face, the skin between the eyebrows, the mouth that had learned to be firm, softened and then held. "I have nothing to steal," she said as if to herself. "People rarely steal what is yours," he said gently. "They take what they've given you to keep for them." She did not turn aside to let him in. She did not need to. He could see enough from where he stood, the corner of a white envelope on the table, the cloth breathing slightly with the secret it had been told. The chair drawn to the window as if a person had been sitting there long enough to forget he had sat at all. "If I ask you tomorrow about glaziers," he said, "you will tell me names." "I know none," she said. He knew. And she looked, not at the chair, not at the window, but at the frame, the work of a dead man's hands. "When a thing goes missing," Maigret said, "one asks what space it leaves." Here, it left a way to speak. He touched his hat brim. "We will talk in the morning." He didn't mean it as a threat. It wasn't one. He walked back toward Lucas, who blew on his fingers and gave a grunt that might have been a question. "Later," Maigret said. They crossed the street together under the flat white sky that, at this hour, had the weary charity of an old bed-sheet. Behind them, in the room with the missing panes, the lamp went out. The draught, honest as ever, took nothing with it but the smell of warm paper and the faintest echo of a voice that had chosen its listener carefully. The morning came with a light frost on the rooftops, the kind that erased the edges of things for an hour before melting away. Maigret sat at his desk, the radiator ticking faintly, a thin plume of smoke from his pipe curling toward the ceiling. Lucas came in with 2 cups of coffee, one of them slopping slightly at the rim. He set it down and leaned against the edge of the desk. "Well?" Lucas asked, but without the eagerness of a man expecting a neat answer. Maigret didn't look up immediately. The boy came for a reason. He passed something through that opening. It was no accident. Lucas nodded. "Drugs? Money?" "Something you can fold," Maigret said. "Something that fits between fingers in the dark without breaking the silence." He tamped the pipe and let the words sit. And she accepted it without surprise. She was ready. Lucas sipped his coffee. "So they're in on something together." "Perhaps. Or perhaps she is a postbox for someone else." Maigret reached for the folded letter in his pocket, the one that had started all this, and laid it flat on the desk. "She wrote to me about missing window panes." She could have gone on as she had, night after night. Why send for me unless she wanted me to see? Lucas frowned. Maybe she's tired of it. Or maybe, Maigret said, she wanted the wrong person to be nervous. They went down to Rue du Chevaleret just after midday, when the shops were quiet, but the street still alive enough not to notice 2 men who didn't belong. The boy was absent from his corner. In his place, a woman in a headscarf sold matches, her eyes darting like a bird's. She said she hadn't seen him since early morning. Madame Villard opened her door at the second knock. Her cardigan was the same as last night, but there was an air about her that was sharper, as if she had been bracing for something. "May we come in?" Maigret asked. She hesitated, then stepped back. The cloth still hung over the frame, though today it had been pinned at the bottom against the draught. Maigret gestured toward it. "You didn't mend it?" "No." Her voice was neutral. "I've no money for that." He sat at the table without waiting to be offered a chair. "We saw someone here last night, madame." "You knew him?" Her fingers moved slightly on the edge of her cardigan. "He's no trouble to anyone." "That depends on what he carries." Her eyes lifted to his, then fell again. "He's a boy. He helps me sometimes." Lucas, leaning against the wall, asked quietly, "Helps you with what?" She didn't answer. The kettle on the stove whistled faintly, though she made no move to fetch it. Maigret let the pause stretch until it felt as thin as the air between the missing panes. "Tell me about Jolivet," Maigret said at last. Something passed over her face, too quick to read. "The rag-and-bone man. He used to know my husband, came for offcuts, old tools. Why?" "He was near here a few nights ago, very early. Then he was working." She smoothed the front of her cardigan, a gesture so habitual it seemed almost like a refuge. "People come and go, Inspector. I don't watch them all." "But you watch some," Maigret said. He rose and went to the window. From here, the street was framed perfectly, the tram stop visible, the boys' corner within reach of a whispered word. He imagined her here night after night, the cloth lifted, waiting for the figure she knew would appear. "You could have replaced the glass," he said without turning. "Even poor work would have kept the weather out. But you didn't." "It's not only for the cold," she said. Her voice was quieter now, as if speaking to herself. "Sometimes you need a little air." On the way out, they passed the neighbor with the coal again. He gave them a narrow look and said, "She's had visitors more this past month than in 10 years. "What kind of visitors?" Maigret asked. "Different ones. Not from here. Don't stay long. Always leave by the front, even if they come in the back." He started up the stairs without further explanation. Back on the pavement, Lucas muttered, "So she's running messages." "Or keeping them," Maigret said. "Which can be worse." They found the boy later that afternoon, loitering near the station where the tram stopped before heading across the river. He looked thinner without his stack of papers, his hands deep in his pockets. "You're keeping bad hours," Maigret said. The boy glanced around. "You followed me?" "I don't need to. You're easy to find." He paused, letting the silence hang until the boy's weight shifted uneasily. "What did you give her last night?" "Nothing." The denial was automatic, too quick. "Try again." The boy's eyes darted toward the tracks, then back. "Just an envelope. Not mine. A man gave it to me. Said to pass it through if the lamp was on." "Who was the man?" "I don't know his name. Tall, coat down to here, hat low, smelled of tobacco and something sharp. He pays in cash." Maigret studied him. "And you've done this before?" The boy's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Only a few times. She doesn't talk, just nods. Sometimes there's an envelope back for me to take." "To the same man?" A nod. "Near the river, under the bridge." It was enough for now. Maigret let him go with only a warning to stay away from Rue du Chevaleret for a few nights. The boy looked relieved and suspicious at the same time, as if unsure whether he'd been spared or marked. That evening, Maigret returned alone to number 14. Madame Villard let him in without question, her eyes flicking once to the darkening street behind him. "There will be no one tonight," he said, standing near the window. "I've seen to that." She didn't answer, but the faintest movement in her jaw suggested the truth had landed where it was meant. "Why keep the window open like this, madam? Why invite the world into your room?" Her gaze dropped to her hands, folded tightly in her lap. "Because sometimes the world sends back something you've been waiting for, and if you close it, you might miss it forever." He watched her for a moment longer, then said, "And what happens when the world sends you something you didn't ask for?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. "Then you send it back." When he left, the frost was already forming again on the cobbles, and the street was quiet except for the distant rattle of a tram. He had the shape of it now. Not the whole, but enough to know where to stand next. The missing glass was less about what had been taken than about what it allowed to pass freely, unseen by anyone but those who knew where to look. And someone, somewhere beyond Rue du Chevaleret, had been looking for a very long time. The frost hadn't lifted by mid-morning. It gave the city a brittle look, as if doors would crack when opened and voices would chip in the air. Maigret did not go at once to the bridge. He spent an hour in the small office where they kept the dull records. a place that smelled of old paste and dust and where time seemed to dry and flake like the labels on the boxes. He wanted Jolivet's father first, then the son. There were scraps enough. Fines for blocking a lane, a caution for carting after hours, a note about a night he'd been found asleep on his own load and taken in because the cold would have finished him if the brandy didn't. On the Sun, fewer marks, but the name came up beside 2 addresses, one by the river, one near the railway sheds. Nothing that tied him to Rue de Chevaleret, everything that left it possible. He went home for lunch because he wanted the quiet of his kitchen and the domestic order in which an idea could stand up without fanfare. The radiators clucked, the window steamed, and the cutlery in the drawer made a clean sound when Madame Maigret set the table. She watched him glance at the pane while he took off his scarf. "You're thinking about your widow," she said. "She isn't mine," he said. "Then you wouldn't be sitting at the window like a dog that has learned the hour the master returns." She ladled soup and, without looking at him, added, "If a woman arranges her room to meet someone without meeting him, she's either ashamed of him or protecting him, or both." He ate 2 spoonfuls before answering. "And sometimes she arranges it so that someone else will notice she has arranged it." "That too," she said. "You men only change the furniture when you mean to be seen doing it." He smiled, and the smile, once it came, stayed. When he left, she wrapped his scarf more firmly and said, "Don't leave it somewhere." This weather doesn't forgive carelessness. He went to the bridge. The boy had said, "under the bridge." Not which one, but there are not so many places where a man can stand in the wind off the water and pretend he isn't waiting. He tried the lower arches where the smell of damp stone lives all year, and he watched. That was most of the work. A woman with a basket crossed and looked down once and never again. A pair of soldiers walked arm to arm, not speaking. A man at the parapet flung the end of a cigarette into the river and left before it hit the water. At last, the boy came. Without papers, he looked younger, his face pale in the light. He had nothing in his hands. That was as it should be. "You don't bring what you've been told you'll receive." He leaned against the embankment, feigning the lazy posture of one who has escaped an errand and isn't eager to be caught and return to it. He did not look around, which told Maigret he had learned something about being looked for. The tall man appeared with the unremarkable punctuality of people who are never named in other people's lives. His coat fell long, his hat brim shadowed his eyes. His gloves were the color of damp straw. He did not offer a greeting. He stood so that the boy would not have to move to reach him. The exchange took a second, 2 at most. An envelope changed hands with the delicacy of people who have practiced a movement enough times that their fingers think before their heads do. Maigret let a tram pass on the level above them and used its brief roar to cross the last meters. He didn't lay a hand on either, not yet. He stepped into their small silence and said, "Good morning." The man's head turned first, then the rest, like a door on oiled hinges. The boy flinched and hid the envelope behind his back with a reflex that made Maigret tired for him. The man did not ask who he was. He did not mistake him either. There's a way people hold themselves around police, as if the air thickens by a degree and the ribs must widen to draw it in. "Shall we not do this here?" the man said. Very mild. "Here is honest enough," Maigret said. "If you like formality, we can have that too." He looked at the boy. "Go home." The boy didn't move. He was torn between running and the fear of choosing the wrong direction. "Go," Maigret repeated, softer. "And if you are asked for tonight, say you're ill." The boy went. The man watched him go without concern, which was useful. It meant the boy was a tool, nothing else. When they were alone, the wind found the small fold of scarf at Maigret's neck. He tucked it in. "You have a neat way with discretion," the man said. "And you have a neat way with envelopes," Maigret returned. "You're careful, but not careful enough. Your boy is a better actor than you are." "Ah," the man said, as if he had been given a detail he could admire. "Shall we walk?" They walked along the quay. The man set a pace that gave him the illusion of choosing it. Maigret let him. After a time, the man said, "I prefer not to give a name. It makes people expect things, and then one is occupied with disappointing them." "You smell of tobacco and something sharp," Maigret said. Last night, the boy remembered that. The sharpness is likely spirits to clean glass or hands. You take care with your fingers. You don't like traces. "Traces are vulgar," the man said, almost with humor. He glanced toward the water. "Are you going to ask me about the widow?" "I'm going to wait until you tell me about her." "Very good," the man murmured. He took off a glove, and Maigret noted the fingers, long, the nails well kept, a small crescent of dirt in the half-moon where a man who works slips sometimes. "There is not much to tell. The city has many cracks in it. Sometimes one needs to pass words through without wetting them." "There are posts," Maigret said. "Telephones. In a pinch, doors." "Posts have keys that do not belong to us," the man said gently. "Telephones ring in rooms we don't choose. As for doors, you know very well they are the noisiest inventions in human history." He pulled the glove back on. "Your work is to dislike this sort of thing. My work is to need it." "Your work," Maigret repeated, and in the neutral way the man had said it, he heard pride in the attempt to make pride sound like necessity. "A profession. Let's call it an arrangement. There are those who wish to speak to those they shouldn't about things that don't concern the world, though the world would be entertained. I arrange for the speaking to happen without the entertaining. Money? Sometimes other things." He glanced at Maigret. "You expect wickedness, perhaps? You will be disappointed." "I expect people," Maigret said. "I'm not often disappointed on that score." He stopped, which made the man stop. "The widow." "She is a window," the man said, not quite smiling at his own joke. "A good one. She understands stillness and doesn't ask questions. She has a way of not existing too much in her street. That is rare. People leak." "And before this," Maigret said, "what did she have? What owed her this usefulness?" The man's gaze went to the river again, as if answers were easier to say to water. "A husband who worked with his hands and knew what measures mean. A life that became very small. People with small lives sometimes have the greatest capacity for exactness." He looked back. "Will you charge her with something?" "Not today," Maigret said. "And you?" "That depends on whether you need to show you have sharp teeth." They stood a time with the river below them, moving as if it were thinking and getting nowhere. "There was an envelope last night," Maigret said. "And sometimes there is one back. Do you open them?" "I am not a postmaster." A small pause, pattered with the feet of a child running overhead along the quay. "I hold them to the light, perhaps. People who fear paper often fear light." "And this chain leads where?" "Where the need ends," the man said. And this time there was no humor in it. "You know as well as I do that the city has loops within loops. We don't pull at all of them, or the carpet comes up and we are all standing on bare boards in winter. Your widow would catch cold." "Does she know what she carries?" "She knows enough. She knows to hold a thing without making it hers." They walked back without speaking. "Near the steps," the man said, as if remembering courtesy, "if you press too hard, another window will open. It is the only reliable principle in Paris. We have built a city that doesn't like to go without air." "Then we will see where the new draft comes from," Maigret said. He watched the man go. Long coat, careful feet, the sense that he would barely wet the soles if he stepped into the Seine. He went to the Quai des Orfèvres and asked Lucas for Jolivet the younger. Lucas found him with the same stubborn competence he applied to his pipe. Slow and inexorable once lit. They didn't haul him in with noise. They asked him to sit, and they made the room small, and then they made it patient. Jolivet was a narrow man who had hands that belonged to someone broader. He sat as if he disliked chairs on principle. "I collect what people have finished with," he said. "Never anything else?" "And glass?" Lucas asked. "If a man tells me to take it away, I take it. If another tells me to bring it back, I bring it, if he pays. I don't ask why a window wants to breathe at night and not in the day." "You were near Chevaleret 2 nights ago," Maigret said. "At 4? "I was where the cart was," Jolivet returned, eyes steady. "It is the only answer that keeps a man in his own bed." "Who told you to muffle your bells?" "No one. Bells talk. Sometimes people want to whisper." He didn't bother to look injured. His pride was too thin for that and too honest. "Did you ever carry envelopes?" He allowed the faintest smile. "I don't carry things that think they can read themselves." He shifted, and for the first time looked tired. "Monsieur, it is cold. Let me go home, and I will tell you if I hear that glass has learned to walk." "Go," Maigret said, "but walk slowly when you pass Rue de Chevaleret. People hear more than they see." When Jolivet had gone, Lucas scratched his head. "They're all innocent, these people." "They are all useful," Maigret corrected. "Innocent is not a word the city gives easily." That night he didn't go to the widow's. He stayed home and sat with his wife while she knitted, the sound of the needles small and busy. She didn't ask, and he didn't volunteer. At 9 he said, "If a person waits for a letter that doesn't come, at what point does the waiting itself become the thing?" "When she begins to make soup for it," Madame Maigret said, not looking up. "When she moves the chair so the waiting can sit." He slept heavily, as if the frost had settled on him. In the morning he went again, to Rue de Chevaleret with a glazier's card in his pocket, not to give it, but to feel its small rectangle against his fingers when he spoke. Madame Villard opened the door with the same controlled care as always. The room had been tidied as if it expected company, though he was the only one who ever came in daylight. "There was no boy," she said. "I know," Maigret said. He stood by the window. The cloth stirred. A tram went by, its bell a tired question. "If there is another envelope to send back, you can give it to me." She looked at him then in a way that made the small hairs on his wrist wake. It wasn't defiance. It was the sudden reckoning of a weight she had carried long enough to forget its name. "I have nothing," she said. It was almost true. "The man who stands under the bridge has a profession," he said. "You have a life." She breathed once to steady herself. If a life is very quiet, it can disguise almost anything. "Even a profession," she said. She moved past him, took the cloth down, folded it on the sill with domestic precision, and for the first time let the room be naked to the street in full day. People outside turned their heads instinctively, not sure what had changed, only that the square of space had become a look. "Would you have me mend it?" he asked, half teasing, half not. She shook her head. "Not yet. If you close an opening too quickly, the house forgets how to breathe." She stood with him a long moment, the cold coming in around their ankles, the draught honest as ever. "He will come," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. "Not the boy. The one who believes he never arrives anywhere. He will come because he thinks he doesn't leave footprints. Tonight, before the frost melts," she said. He left her there and stepped into the street with the sense that a door had opened somewhere he couldn't see. The day was pale. The city seemed to be holding its breath again. He went back to the office and told Lucas to eat early and wear boots. "We'll stand where people think no one ever stands," he said. Lucas grunted something that meant he'd already put the boots under his desk. "And if no one comes, then we will have learned how far a certain kind of man trusts his own invisibility," Maigret said. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke cool, and in it he almost saw the shape of a figure who came and went like a draught, confident of the air and reckless with the lives that needed it. The frost held until evening, clinging to the gutters like a stubborn thought. Maigret left the office early enough to walk once around Rue du Chevaleret while it was still light, to let the street see him without remembering him later. He did not go up. The widow's window was bare again. The cloth had been folded away. The square looked both indecent and brave, a mouth that had decided to speak. He and Lucas ate quickly at a cafe that washed its glasses in water, that smelled faintly of fennel. Lucas had brought the boots as told and wore them with the unhappy dignity of a man who suspects he will stand a long time and not move. They said little. When they rose, the sky was the color of a pewter plate, the edges blurred, the first drip beginning to fall from a cornice here and there. "Before the frost melts," she had said. The phrase had the weight of habit. At 10, they took their places, not opposite each other as before, but skewed, so that each could see what the other could not. Lucas settled in the stairwell across the street behind a window, whose pane had a bubble in it, like a flaw in a bad thought. Maigret chose the landing inside number 14, one flight down from the widow's door, where the lamplight from the stair gave just enough to read a man's shoes, not his face. The building smelt of cold wood and the old cabbage. Somewhere, a clock that didn't belong to anyone in particular knocked the quarter hours gently on the air. He listened. The day in a city is a thing of sights. The night is what it tells you with its throat. He heard the tram's bell grow uncertain, the rattle of a cart with its bells swaddled, then only the tiny industry of water loosening one grain of frost at a time. The back door, which he had found locked so many times, sighed once as if a person had leaned on it without meaning to. He imagined, rather than saw, the wedge of shadow that would be a man's shoulder sliding past the milk of the stairwell glass. Footsteps came without the usual lie that footsteps tell on stairs, the abrupt hurry, the pause before a door, the betrayal of a man who remembers where he lives. These were steps that trusted nothing to memory. They stopped a half landing below, waited as if they were counting with a pulse, then continued. They came level with him and did not falter, which told him the man had seen him and decided he was furniture. That pleased Maigret. A policeman is never so strong as when he is mistaken for a chair. The figure passed, tall coat brushed by the banister, hat held low in the hand, a glove folded inside it, hands that disliked to be trapped. The smell that reached him was tobacco and the same clean sharpness the boy had noted. He went up the last steps and didn't knock. The widow's door opened the width of a latch, then a touch more. A narrow, careful voice, hers, said something that the wood ate. Maigret moved only when the door closed again. He stood with his ear to the panels and heard the difference an opening makes to a room, the way the air alters its shape when two people stand inside it. No words at first. There is a language that happens before words when people who have been speaking without being seen finally see. He waited for it to become something he could write in ink. "You shouldn't have come," she said. The sentence was not reproachful. It had the resignation of a woman who has baked too long and knows the crust will crack if you ask it not. 2. "I don't come," the man said, mild as before. "That is my only talent." "You are here all the same," she answered. "Because your lamp didn't go on," he said after a moment. "And because the boy is suddenly ill. You sent me the kind of message that never gets lost." "I sent for someone else," she said. "I know," the man replied, and now there was the smallest roughness in the smooth voice. "You chose a man who stands in stairwells and turns into oak. It is a preference." "Close the window," she said. "It's already closed," he said. "You took away the cloth." "It is open," she insisted, and in the word open there was more than air. Maigret let his knuckles touch the door, not knocking so much as letting the wood feel his hand. The pause in the room had the quality of a held breath that acknowledges another's lungs. The latch went. He entered because men like him rarely ask permission when the threshold has already told them its answer. The two of them stood as he had imagined. The tall man with his hat in his hand, so very careful with his outline, the widow by the table with that folded cloth like a towel in a good kitchen. She was not frightened. She had the look of someone who has decided that if the end of a thing is coming, it should at least arrive while the room is in order. "Good evening," Maigret said. He took off his hat, because he always did in front of women who kept their hair tidy. The tall man's smile was a polite imperfection. "You are as punctual as river fog, Inspector. You arrive and one doubts one ever saw the other bank." "Sit," the widow said. It was to both of them, and to neither. It was to the room, to keep it from rising. They sat. The window was the only thing standing. "You put her to work," Maigret said to the man. "You paid her? Or is it a charity you do in your head?" "I gave her back the exactness that life took when her husband died," the man said softly. "Some people are happier when something must be placed exactly so. And what do you place exactly so? Words that don't like envelopes with stamps." He turned his hat once, then stopped. "We made a simple space between two complications. Paris is grateful for such spaces even when it denies them." "This last envelope," Maigret said. "What was in it?" The man's eyes were too tired to lie well at this hour. "Paper. You know that already from the way it moved. You want the name on the paper, but names are the only thing that hurt people in a city. The rest they can survive." The widow spoke without looking at either of them. "The name is a woman's," she said. She lifted her face and looked at Maigret, not at the man. "It has been a woman's most nights." "Which woman?" Maigret asked, because sometimes a clean question is kinder than a guess. The widow's mouth tightened, but not with disapproval. "It is not the same woman. Some are wives. Some are not yet wives. Some were wives once and returned their rings to drawers." She looked at the window again. "But I know the name that keeps coming back." The tall man's fingers opened on his hat brim and then closed again. "We are not in the business of scandal," he said, but his voice had become thinner, as if it had been walking for hours. "You remove the panes yourself," Maigret said, turning to him, not as an accusation, but as the end of a thought. "You knew how. You smelled of spirits. You softened the putty, lifted the glass without breaking the lines. Jolivet took them away so the house would not think it could be mended by accident." The man inclined his head. "I made a window that could be a mouth without teeth," he said, "and I believed I never arrived anywhere because I never left a mark. That is a vanity like any other." "Why this house?" Maigret asked. The man looked at the widow in a way that was almost grateful. "Because she watched the street at the hour when people don't yet admit they are watching. Because she understands that standing can be an occupation." He breathed out. "Because once, years ago, I came to the door to sell her glass, and she didn't bargain. She paid what it cost because the measure was correct, and not because she had the money. People like that are rare." The widow smiled the smallest smile at the word glass, a private joke with a dead man. "My husband cared about measures," she said. "He said men who cheat on wood cheat on themselves first." "And the name that keeps coming back?" Maigret asked gently. She said it, and the room altered. It was not a name to print in a newspaper. It belonged to a woman who lived 3 streets over and sold good linen and had a husband whose shoulders, when he walked, seemed to apologize for being in the way. The man across from Maigret closed his eyes the same way one closes a book to keep the page from being turned by another's hand. "You carry his words," Maigret said to him, "to a woman who is not his wife." "I carry a hush," the man said wearily. "I arrange for people to be quieter than they could be if they tried it alone. They ruin more with noise than with what they do." "And what is it tonight?" Maigret asked. "Not noise. Something that made her send for me." The widow's hands were very still. "Tonight he wanted to take something back," she said. The tall man looked at her, and for the first time there was heat in his face. "I wanted to stop something," he said, to her, not to Maigret. "There are letters you can put in the fire because they contain only a man's ache, and there are letters that are like a match themselves." He turned back. The husband. He has learned a little. He asks too many questions. He watches a window that is not his. So you would pull up the carpet before anyone trips, Maigret said, and you come yourself because you believe your silence can do the work of 3 men's anger. The man's mouth twitched. Something like that. And what do you want me to do? Maigret asked the widow. She looked relieved that someone had finally asked it out loud. I want the window mended, she said, not because of the cold, because the air has started to carry things I don't want. When a room has been useful too long, people decide it will be useful forever, and that is how accidents happen. The tall man's head bowed slightly, as if he were receiving communion from a very old priest. I can mend it, he said, and then, with a wryness that had turned on him, I can mend many things I break. No, she said, not you. Silence put its hand on the table like a fourth person. From the street came the soft sound of water loosening the last skin of frost from a gutter. Lucas, patient in the opposite stairwell, would be watching the square of the window and seeing nothing but the shape of space. The city had begun to breathe again. Maigret stood. He had what he needed to move the pieces without making a show. You will go home, he said to the tall man, by the way you came, without stopping to speak to any woman who owns a name. Tomorrow you will take your profession for a walk somewhere else. There are other cracks in the city. Leave this one to close. And if I don't? The man asked, without threat. You will, Maigret said. You are vain about never arriving. It would wound you to be somewhere I can point at. The man smiled, and it was crooked now. Human. Inspector, you remove a pane just as neatly as I do. He rose, nodded to the widow with the courtesy of a court he did not belong to, and left as he had come, taking nothing, leaving less. When the door had shut and the steps had thinned into the house's own creaks, the widow sank into the chair by the window as if she had been carrying something on her shoulders and had finally put it down. It was not collapse. It was what happens when exactness is no longer required. Her eyes reddened, but she did not weep. I like the waiting, she said, surprising herself with the confession. Not the letters, the waiting. It was like knitting in the dark. You count without seeing, and you know if your hands have betrayed you. He did not answer. He looked at the frame, at the clean bevels where a good man's fingers had once pressed putty. A glazier will come at 9, he said, though he had not yet made the call. A man who is careless with measures will not do. She nodded, accepting decisions as one accepts weather. And the boy, she asked. He will have had an illness that lasts 2 days, Maigret said. After that, he will sell papers again and call out headlines without reading them. And the woman with the linen, she said almost to herself. She will go on folding things, he said, and her husband will go on walking. With the same shoulders, perhaps he will look up at his own window once in a while. It wouldn't hurt him. She almost smiled. You are kinder than I expected. I am as kind as the city allows, he said. He took his hat. Close this tonight with the cloth. In the morning, let the man with the proper tools do what he knows. When he stepped into the stair, the building gave a little grunt, as if settling back into its bones. Outside, the thaw had begun in earnest. Drops struck the pavement with the brisk rhythm of a watch being wound. Across the way, through the bubbled pane, he saw Lucas make the small gesture that meant, well. Maigret's answering tilt of the head said, enough. They walked together to the corner in a silence that was not empty. It was just the right size. At the bridge, later, the river moved with a new skin, gray over black. He stood a minute and felt the city's long exhale at his back. The case would not end with an arrest that pleased anyone. It would end with a piece of glass. Cut true, a chair moved back to where it had always belonged, and a woman who would discover, perhaps with surprise, that she could live without waiting and still know exactly where to put her hands. The glazier came just before 9, a compact man with a wool cap pulled low and a toolbox that sounded like a drawer full of spoons when he set it down. Maigret was already in the hall, hat in hand, and the building smelled faintly of boiled coffee and damp coats. Madame Villard had swept the room so thoroughly that the broom stood still in the corner like a witness told to wait. She watched the glazier measure the frame with a steel tape that gave a small, satisfied click each time it went home. "Good wood," the man said, more to the frame than to the people. Someone who knew the hand's distance did this. He softened the old putty with a warm knife and did not speak again except to himself, in numbers. The new panes, cut on the landing, flashed once like coins. When he pressed each into place and smoothed the bead, the room made a small, pleased sound, as if a missing tooth had been found and set back where it belonged. Madame Villard stood very straight. "Will it take long to set?" she asked, out of politeness. "The weather will do the work," the glazier said. "Don't lean on it. Don't argue with it. Glass prefers to be agreed with." He wrote a figure on a carbon slip with blunt care. "Someone already came by to say the bill had a name," he added, not looking up. "Said I should leave it at the ironmonger's. That suits me." Maigret did not ask whose name. He didn't need to. When the man had gone and the room had resumed its modest shape, the widow put her fingertips lightly on the sill, not to test the glass, but to confirm the measure. The street looked farther away and nearer at the same time. "You can forget the cloth," Maigret said. She nodded, as if someone had told her she might put away, mourning. "He came?" she asked, not with hope or dread, but with the need to close a ledger. "He came," Maigret said. "He will not come again." She breathed out through her nose, very slow. "I will make coffee," she said, and the words contained a small tremor of relief, as if coffee were the first ordinary thing the room had permitted in days. Afterwards, he left her standing with 2 cups in the sink and went toward the linen shop 3 streets over. It was the sort of place that smelled of starch and old wood and faint lavender from sachets that had been on the shelves so long they had given their scent to the varnish. Bolts of cloth stood like careful soldiers. The bell above the door rang half-heartedly when he entered. Madame le Maire, the name had been spoken last night like a pin drawn, stood behind the counter with her hands flat, palms down, as if learning how to keep them still. She was in her early 40s, perhaps, with that tidy prettiness Parisians sometimes keep like a good dress they don't wear on weekdays. She looked at his hat, at his face, and then away, as if she had seen him already in the stories she had told herself, and had hoped it would not be true. "Are you the police?" she asked in a voice that didn't want the answer. "I am Maigret," he said, which was both an answer and not. He gestured toward the door at the back. "Could we speak where your bolts of cloth will not overhear?" She led him into a small room that had a table where someone ate quickly and an iron where someone lingered. She shut the door carefully and immediately opened the high transom a crack, as though air must be let to stand guard. "My husband is out," she said, before he could pose any arrival of questions. "He goes to the wholesaler on Thursdays. He comes back with invoices he doesn't like and a headache. I have 20 minutes. He did not take out a notebook. "There were letters," he said. "They went and came. You sent for one to be taken back." She put her fingers to her throat, not to touch a necklace, but the place where a string might have been. "I wanted it to stop," she said. And then, because she had not planned to say more and found herself saying it, there wasn't, he wrote. It made me feel as if something still moved in me that wasn't linen. That is all." "And the man who wrote?" Maigret asked. "A man who likes to believe women appear only when he thinks of them," she said, with a weariness that had less malice than pity. "A man I knew before I married. He found me again last spring when my mother died and I went to the cemetery alone. He said I was foolish to stand by myself. I was foolish to believe that mattered." "And your husband," he said, because people hurt themselves less when the words are placed simply. "He suspects everything," she said. "He suspects the weather of arriving for someone else. He has never struck me. He has never even raised his voice. But he has a way of holding the air accountable. She looked at the iron and then at him. He began to notice that letters came and went and the postman didn't know. He began to look up when he turned the key. He is a man who apologizes when he enters a room, Inspector. When such a man begins to watch, the watching is a kind of violence. You sent for your letter last night, Maigret said. It said I would leave, she said in a whisper, as if the words might take literal shape and try to go out by the transom. As if a person could be reduced to one crack of a door. She looked at him with a sudden fierceness that made her younger. I don't want to leave. I want to live where I said I would live, tired or not, with the man who apologizes to chairs. He nodded. The window is mended, he said. There will be no more letters by that route. If one comes another way, you will do what is, as you say, not linen. She smiled then, suddenly and truly, the first smile of a woman who remembers her own face. I will, she said. I will burn it the way my mother taught me to burn threads. In a saucer, in the sink, with a tap running. The bell in the shop rang again. Footsteps, heavier than hers and not practiced at discretion, crossed the floor. Her eyes widened without alarm. It is him, she whispered, and then she surprised herself by adding, Will you stay? If you like, he said. Monsieur le Maire came in with a paper sack under his arm and the shoulders Maigret had seen from a distance many times, apologetic in outline and yet stubborn when the apology was not accepted. He stopped when he saw the inspector and put the sack on the table very carefully, as if it contained eggs, though it contained nothing but white receipts. Inspector, he said, uncertain between deference and suspicion. We were talking about glass, Maigret said. A window that needed mending. Monsieur le Maire's face did something complicated and then chose simplicity. It's better, he said. He looked at his wife and then away, not because he feared what he would see, but because he feared revealing what he hoped not to see. I go sometimes, he said abruptly, to the inspector and to the air, to look at people's windows. You understand? It is a stupidity. I get up from the bed and go to the kitchen, and I look at the black in the window as if it could tell me someone else's name. It's a habit like smoking, Maigret said. Some nights you forget your matches and you sleep. Monsieur le Maire laughed once, with a sound like a cupboard closing, if one is allowed. One allows oneself, Maigret said. It is less elegant, but more reliable. Madame le Maire stood with her hands against the back of a chair, not gripping it. Armand, she said quietly, and the name was a rope extended rather than thrown. There will be no more letters. He nodded before. She finished the sentence, as if he had been hoping for the exact shape of those words and could not bear to let them be taken back. He looked at Maigret. Do you make an arrest? He asked, not challenging, only wanting to know if a public thing would be made of a private one. No, Maigret said. I don't believe the city needs that kind of entertainment today. Monsieur le Maire's shoulders eased, and in easing they seemed to find a new position that was not apology but occupation. Thank you, he said, which was addressed to no one in particular, and all three of them at once. I will mend the back step this afternoon, he added absurdly, and the absurdity was the right size to carry them out of the room without falling. Maigret left them to the bolts of linen. In the street the frost had retreated to the shadows like a sulk. He stood a moment and watched the boy at the corner selling papers again with the brisk shame of someone who has been told to keep his pocket out of other people's stories. The boy saw him and did an odd little half-salute that men do when they are full of gratitude and don't know where to put it. Maigret bought a paper he would not read. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lognon was waiting with a file he held as if it were contagious. I hear you've been putting panes in and taking them out, he said gloomily. The newspapers prefer murders. They like a number to put next to the mayor's frown. The newspapers will have to do with linen today, Maigret said. He hung his coat and sat. The radiators ticked as if marking the end of something. He wrote 3 notes. One to the local post about leaving Rue du Chevaleret alone unless asked. One to Lucas reminding him to forget a boy's face. One to the glazier with an address and no explanation beyond a line that asked him to send his bill to a name that would be waiting. When he went back to number 14 late in the afternoon, a tiny square of light lay on the floor just inside the window, the way light only lies through clean glass. The room looked like itself again. Madame Villard had set a small vase on the sill with 2 sprigs of something green that could have been parsley or could have been hope. "You took up gardening," he said. "It was on the kitchen window before," she said, almost shy. "I brought it here. It likes the front." "Many things do," he said. He stood with his hat in his hands and didn't know where to put them. "Do you miss it?" he asked finally, and the question was not about a man or an envelope, but about a waiting she had done so exactingly that it had become a task. She considered and did not rush. "Not yet," she said. "It is like after someone dies. The first hours are very clean. Later, one does the dusting and finds something they left where it shouldn't be, and then one remembers to remember." He nodded. "If anyone comes to the window, you will call," he said out of habit. "If anyone comes to the window," she said, "they will see themselves and go away." On his way out, he met Jolivet in the hall, his cap in his hands, as if it were a bad hat he intended to sell to a man with poor taste. "Monsieur," Jolivet said, not quite deferential, "if you want me to take away anything else no one wants, you tell me." Maigret smiled at him with a weariness that was kin to affection. "I will," he said. "But tonight we have enough air." He walked until the street ended at a river that did what rivers do, whether men write letters or not. It had the color of pewter under a sky the color of dishwater, and somewhere a barge moved with a sound like a long coat being shaken. He leaned on the rail and put his pipe between his teeth without lighting it. A man passed and didn't recognize him. Another, careful with his outline, crossed the bridge as if proving a point to himself. Maigret watched the water part itself around a wooden post and imagined the city's countless small openings. Cracks for words, holes for glances, gaps where air got in and out, and how, most days, no one drowns for them. When he went home, Madame Maigret had already set the soup on the table and put the scarf over the back of his chair to dry. "How was the weather?" she asked, which was how she always asked for the kind of day he had had. "It is mending," he said. She nodded, and they ate. Outside, the glass at their own window held the night comfortably in place, and the draught, honest still, ran its thin finger along the sill and found nothing it could take. By morning, the city had that rinsed look it gets after a thaw, when the gutters remember their purpose and every pigeon seems newly minted. Maigret went first to the ironmonger, not because there was anything to buy, but because in such places bills announce themselves more honestly than people do. Old Bousquet had his spectacles on the very tip of his nose and a pencil behind his ear, as if he meant to harpoon prices with it. "You sent a glazier up the street," Bousquet said before Maigret spoke, "which is how small tradesmen like to let you know they see as much as you do, only nearer." He tapped a paper on the counter. "Left the note here, as always." The slip had 2 figures. Next to the first, a neat, reserved hand had written a name Maigret already expected. A. Lemaire. Beneath it, in a different ink, a small postscript: "If the first gentleman is absent, debit my account." The signature wasn't a name so much as an arrangement of strokes that disliked the idea of letters belonging to anyone. Bousquet, who had been on the street long enough to be polite to every kind of discretion, sniffed. "The second one came in at dawn, before I put the kettle on. Paid a little on account, as if he owed the weather back wages." "Keep the first name," Maigret said. "Men like to mend something you can point at." Bousquet folded the paper with the slow care of someone putting away a wedding linen. "You play carpenter now," he said, not without approval. The boy was at his corner again, the stack of papers taller than his wrist. He called the headlines with a briskness that sounded like an apology for not having any. When he saw Maigret, he tucked his chin into his collar as if it could shorten his height and make him younger. "You said 2 days," he muttered. "And you've given me 2, Maigret said. "Keep the third for yourself." He bought a paper he wouldn't read and held it like a truce. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas had put his boots in a corner to steam and was eating a hard pear with the patient violence of a man who makes fruit remember where it came from. "Lognon's been sniffing around," he said. "He says if we don't give him a corpse, he'll find one himself, and then it will belong to him and his moustache forever." "Let him," Maigret said. He wrote a short, impolite line to the small police post near Chevaleret. No patrols passed number 14 without knocking on the air first, and left it for the runner. It should have ended there. Cases like this have the good manners to finish where they began, with the street returning to its usual smallness. But towards 4, when the light had the thin yellow of poor tea, the telephone on his desk rang. Madame Villard's voice, flat and careful, said, "Someone is here." He asked for the window. He arrived to find the stair smelling faintly of soap, as if someone had wiped the day off the banister. The door to the flat stood ajar. In the front room, the new panes held the street like a picture. The man by the window had his hat in both hands. It was not the tall man. It was Lemaire, the linen seller, his shoulders making their familiar apology to the air even while he stood in the most forward place in the room. "I came to see," he said without turning. "What?" Maigret asked from the doorway. "That it is glass," Lemaire said, as if the answer cost him something. "That it is a window like other windows. My wife told me. She said you would not make a show of it. I believed her. Then I walked here anyway." He turned. He had the face of a man who had not slept much, but his mouth wasn't bitter, only tired of learning his own edges. "I wanted to see what a thing looks like when it stops being a corridor." Madame Villard stood at the table with her hands linked. She looked at Lemaire without embarrassment. "I used to watch your shop," she said unexpectedly. "When the tram stops here and empties, men look at your window because it is always tidy. Women go inside and speak softly. It is a good place for a city to fold itself." Lemaire's mouth made a shape that might have been a laugh in better weather. "And yet," he said to Maigret, "I stood in my kitchen and watched my own window in the dark as if it were a mouth that would say a name to me." He pressed his hat brim with his thumbs until it remembered the curve it had been trained to hold. "A ridiculous work for a grown man." "It's a work like any other," Maigret said. "Some men polish teaspoons at 3 in the morning. Some count their breaths. All of it is a way of measuring fear. Sometimes the fear is of something. Sometimes it is only the fear that nothing at all is moving." Lemaire's eyes shone too brightly for a moment, and then did not. He put the hat down on the sill with an exaggerated gentleness. "I found a letter in the spring," he said. "Not mine. I burned it without reading it through." He looked at the widow. "I'm sorry if I've used your room to get used to an idea I should have learned at my own table." "You paid for the glass," she said, which in her idiom was both acceptance and reproof. "I did," he said. He thought to add something like, "It was nothing," but didn't. The small correction pleased Maigret more than a speech would have. The corridor outside made a small noise, the usual house settling, but the 3 of them looked anyway, as people do when they have taught themselves to attend to drafts. Nothing more came of it. Lemaire took up his hat again. "Thank you for letting me see," he said to the widow, and to Maigret he added, "I will go home by the wide streets. Narrow ones make a man think too neatly." When he had gone, Madame Villard sat, not so much with relief as with the fatigue of someone who has kept a room steady for other people and now allows the furniture to rest. "He is a good man," she said, as if reporting a weather condition. "He is a man," Maigret said. "Most days that is close enough." He left her with the soft sound of wash water starting in the kitchen and the sight of the new glass refusing to fog even when the kettle protested. On the corner, the boy had arranged his remaining papers into a smaller, prouder stack. When Maigret passed, the boy said without preface, "He asked me if the window was mended." The man with the coat. "And you said?" "I said glass prefers to be agreed with." The boy replied, the phrase learned from the glazier, proud and a little defiant. He laughed like a man who has remembered something at the wrong time. "Will he make you carry anything again?" Maigret asked. The boy looked down the length of Rue du Chevaleret as if it were a line drawn under a sum. "I don't think so. He said other cracks are waiting." "Sell your papers, then," Maigret said. "If anyone offers you work that pays too much for keeping your mouth shut, charge more for the paper instead." The evening grew out of the afternoon without changing its close. At the office, there were the usual small vexations. Lucas had lost a pencil and found it triumphantly in his own air. A man from Montreux wanted to file a complaint against a dog that limped in a menacing way. Lognan trailed a rumor that someone in the 11th had pushed his mistress down a stair and then gone to confession with unhelpful zeal. Through it, the picture of the mended window stayed at the edge of Maigret's mind, not insisting on itself, only existing the way a chair exists in a room where someone is finally willing to sit. He meant to go home, but his feet took him by habit towards the quay. On the bridge a figure paused, slender under a long coat. For a heartbeat, Maigret thought it was the same man, drawn back as men are sometimes drawn to their own cleverness. But when the figure turned its head, the face was wrong, and then it was gone. And even if it had been him, the river gives men away to be nowhere, an instant after they have been somewhere. He went down under the arch, where the city's breath always lingers, and stood with his hands in his pockets and his pipe unlit to feel the cold without talking about it. From there, Paris sounds like itself, the slap of water against stone, a laugh dropped somewhere and carried, the tram bell up on the quay marking distances for people who don't think they need them. When he walked back across the square near Rue du Chevaleret, the ironmonger's window was dark, but Bousquet himself, locking up late, raised a hand. "The bill's settled," he called in a voice that respected the hour. "By the first name." The other gentleman came in and left enough to cover anyone who made a promise and ran out of luck. Maigret nodded. It was the ending he had expected and arranged without writing it down, each pride satisfied in a way that let it shrink to a normal size again. He felt the small, ridiculous contentment that comes when a detail fits a shape you've been drawing in your head. At home, Madame Maigret had put a branch of laurel in a tumbler near the stove because a neighbor had given it, and it seemed a shame to leave it outside. "How is your window?" she asked, meaning the widow's and the day's both. "It holds," he said. "The draft has learned to use the door." She made a sound that might have been approval or might have been the spoon against the pot. "There will be a day when you are bored," she said cheerfully. "You will be obliged to read your own newspaper." He sat, stretching his legs under the table to the place where the heat gathered like a cat. "The boy at the corner will choose my headline for me," he said. "He owes me that much." After the washing up, he went out once more alone, not to chase anything, only to look at the sky over the roofs. The air had that clean taste it sometimes acquires after a long dampness, as if the city had rinsed its mouth. He cut across to a small cafe that kept its lights low and its beer honest. At a back table, a man argued politely with a woman about the merits of a certain kind of curtain ring. The proprietor wiped the same place on the counter as if it were the whole of his territory. Maigret took a seat by the window, and when he looked out, he saw the reflection of himself, superimposed on the street, a large man with a hat who kept his own company well. He thought, without embarrassment and without great philosophy, about pains and drafts and the peculiar relief that comes when a thing that has been used improperly is put back to the work it was made for. A window is not a portal, and when it behaves like one, people start to speak too softly and listen too hard. He had given Rue du Chevaleret its proper weather back, and in return it had given him nothing dramatic at all. He preferred it that way. When he stood to leave, the proprietor said, "Cold night, Inspector." "It is mending," Maigret replied, and put his hat on and buttoned his coat, and stepped out into a city that had decided, for the time being, to keep its secrets behind glass, where they belonged. The next morning had the dry cold of a room that has been tidied and left, the kind that makes a man put on his coat even to fetch the paper from the hall. Madame Maigret set a bowl on the table and said the things she says when she thinks a case is over but wants to be sure. "Will you be late?" He said he wouldn't, which was both true and not. With these quiet matters, the lateness is inside you, and you carry it through the day like a pocket you forgot to empty. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the radiators clicked as if remembering a joke. Lognan appeared with a face like a cold plate. "A grocer says a woman is stealing sardines with a baby carriage," he announced, hopeful for disappointment. "If you like the smell of oil, the 11th offers you the world." "Give the baby the carriage," Maigret said, "and the sardines to the dog." Lognan looked injured, as if he had been refused a morale. He had hardly sat down when the boy from Rue du Chevaleret came to the door and stood there as if a threshold were an obstacle that needed a plan. Lucas glanced up and then away. The boy didn't cross the room until Maigret lifted a hand, and even then he seemed to come less to a man than to an idea he had been warned against. "You told me to keep the third day," the boy said. "I kept it, but someone kept a piece of it for himself." Maigret nodded to the chair. The boy sat on the edge and produced an envelope from under his jacket with that reluctance people have when they feel a thing still has warmth from a previous owner. The envelope was plain, unstamped, the flap tucked, not sealed. "He was on the bridge," the boy said. "Not under. He said, 'If you see him, give him this. If you don't see him, give it to the river.' I saw you yesterday, so now I give it to you." "You did well," Maigret said. He did not open the envelope at once. The boy's eyes stayed on his hands as if any gesture might spill something. "How much did he pay you to throw it away?" "More than the papers," the boy said with a sudden, raw pride. Then, ashamed of that pride, he added, "I kept the papers." "You keep them both," Maigret said, and the boy understood and went. He opened the envelope when the room had taken back its own noises. There was no letter, only a small triangle of glass, the corner cut from a square, the kind glaziers make and then leave on a sill without thinking. It caught the light the way a word catches sense when you turn it. In the bottom of the envelope, folded neat, a strip of paper with 4 words in a hand that disliked to be known: "For your troublesome drafts." He held the piece between his thumb and forefinger and felt the thinness of it, the exact weight of the small truth it wanted to carry. He put it in his pocket, not as evidence, but the way a man keeps a button he means to sew on when he is less distracted. He went first to the ironmonger because men like Bousquet are the city's honest minutes. The old fellow had his pencil behind his ear again and a ledger open. "All square," Bousquet said without being asked. The gentleman with the initials paid for what he broke. The husband paid for what he sleeps next to. If more people divided their bills that way, we'd have fewer arguments in January. "January makes arguments," Maigret said. "So does August," Bousquet returned. "It's only that in January you can see your breath while you shout." On Rue du Chevaleret, the window at number 14 had taken on the look of something that had been there always. The glass set its own silence in the room. Madame Villard opened to him with the calm of someone whose house has agreed to be a house again. There was a smell of coffee and of bread crisping under the grill. She had moved the parsley back to the kitchen. The front sill now held nothing but light. "There was a boy," she said by way of greeting, remembering the boy as one remembers a cousin who stayed too long and was kind without knowing it. "He has returned to his corner," Maigret said. He took the triangle of glass from his pocket and set it on the table where the sun, such as it was, could find it. "A souvenir," he said, "from the man who likes to arrive nowhere." She looked at it as if it were a letter she had decided not to read. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "It will be good for anchoring paper," she said, and fetched a folded recipe from the dresser, a list in her husband's old hand for a tart he had promised to master, and never did. She slid the triangle onto the corner of the paper with an exactness that would have pleased him. "He would have liked this," she said, not of the man with the long coat, but of the one who had known measures. "You slept?" Maigret asked. "I did," she said, and then, honest as the draught had ever been, twice I got up and stood by the window because I thought I had forgotten something. The second time I realized it was only the habit of being useful. I went back to bed and decided to be useless until morning. "Uselessness is a strong medicine," he said, and she permitted herself a small laugh the room could accommodate. He left her washing the cups with the care of someone who has chosen a life and found it exactly the right size. When he passed the boy's corner, the boy didn't call a headline. He said, "I won't go to the bridge again," as if he were telling the city and wanted a witness. "Go when you want to see water," Maigret said, "not when you want to be seen." The linen shop had its door propped open with a folded bolt that looked too fine to suffer such a job. Inside, Madame Le Maire was marking hems with pins, her mouth pursed in the old concentration of someone who was taught to be precise by women who would be disappointed but not surprised if she failed. She looked up and met his eyes without the defensive spark of yesterday. It had been put away with the receipts. Behind her, Monsieur Le Maire was indeed mending the back step, planing the edge where people's feet had taught it to splinter. The shavings curled like small blonde questions and fell, unanswered, to the floor. "You came to inspect our carpentry," he said, not unamused. "To buy 2 meters of ribbon and pay too much," Maigret said. He paid too much and let him see it, because men like that need to feel the world occasionally decides in their favor without their having asked. "The window is glass," he added, though they knew. "It makes a man's habits less dramatic." "In the dark last night," Madame Le Maire said, "I went to the kitchen for water and was afraid of my window out of habit. Then it showed me only my face." "That can be a fright too," her husband put in, but his smile had the newfound simplicity of a man who will not apologize to furniture, unless it deserves it. When he returned to the office, Lucas mentioned a man who had come by to ask if the inspector ever returned lost things to their owners, with advice attached. "Long coat, careful hands," Lucas said, lighting his pipe and squinting through the first false draw. "I told him we were closed for repairs. He said repairs were his line and left." "Repairs are everyone's line," Maigret said. He sat and wrote a note for the file that would never be read. No proceedings. The city mended itself where it was torn, with help from those who tore it. He closed the folder and put it where such things go, when the law has chosen to be as patient as a staircase. In the late afternoon, a small, unnecessary errand took him back past number 14. He didn't go up. He stood across from the window long enough to watch it hold its reflection and give it back to the street. The boy called something to a customer. A woman adjusted her scarf. A cat, disdainful of repairs, crossed the road as if it had paid for the stones. A tram rattled, and in the glass, the movement made a ribbon of light slide along the inside of the room and vanish under the table. It pleased him in the way wet pavements please men who like to think with their feet. He found himself near the bridge as evening settled into the water. A barge moved under the arch, with the sound of a thought passing from one mind to another, without either owner noticing. He stood with his hands in his pockets and imagined, without bitterness, the tall man at some other crack in the city, instructing air to behave, teaching people how to whisper with their hands. Perhaps the man would last a year before some other window decided to be a window again and not a mouth. Perhaps he would last longer. The city has room for many professions that don't pay taxes. He turned toward home. In the courtyard of his building, a neighbor was shaking a rug with the resigned savagery that keeps a marriage intact. The stair smelled of soap and old coats, which is to say it smelled of ordinary life. Inside, Madame Maigret had a pot on the stove that made the air polite. She took his hat and, without inquiry, set it where it would dry. "Your scarf," she said, finding it under his arm as if she were rescuing a small animal from danger. "You brought it home today." "I'm mending," he said, which made her smile without agreeing. Over soup, he told her about the triangle of glass and set it on the table so the lamp could make its small, bright language. She touched it with a forefinger. "It's not sharp," she said, as if disappointed and relieved. "It has done its cutting," he said. "It can rest." "And your widow?" she asked. "She's knitting with both hands again," he said. "She has removed the chair from the window as if it were a guest who stayed too long and wrote no letters after leaving." They ate, and then, because there was an hour left in the day that didn't belong to anyone, he walked to the small cafe that keeps its lights low for people who prefer the company of a noise to the company of a person. He took his beer to the table by the window. The glass there had a flaw, a bubble like a trapped breath, so that the street outside swelled and narrowed as people passed. It reminded him of how stories look from inside the room where they happen and from the pavement where they are guessed at. He thought briefly of Lognon, who would find his corpse somewhere and announce to his mustache that the world had behaved correctly after all. He thought of Jolivet, who would pad his bells and move under the city's skin as modestly as blood. He thought of the boy, who would learn to price his labor like a decent tradesman. He thought of Lemaire, who would sand a step until the edge agreed with feet. He thought of a woman who would put a parsley sprig where the light pleased it. And then he stopped thinking in lists and let the room do the counting for him. When he left, the cold was honest, and the wind made a point of his ears. He lit his pipe only once, and it was enough. The ember burned with the steady satisfaction of work completed without ceremony. In the square by the river, a gust pushed the water into small, quick scales, and the lamps along the quay wrote their names in the dark, and then crossed them out with a shrug. He paused under the arch, where the air remembers voices. From there, Paris had the sound he trusted, an ordinary clatter, a muffled laugh, the deliberate clink of a key tried twice. Beside him, the stone was wet where people had leaned their shoulders and found them stronger than whatever they were thinking. He put his hand there and felt the coolness. It felt like glass that had decided to be glass again. When he reached home, the window in his kitchen was lightly fogged from the soup. He wiped a circle with the edge of his sleeve, the way a boy does, and looked out at nothing in particular. The circle cleared and then softened as the warm air reclaimed it. He did not mind. Some nights you look through. Some nights you let the pain do its quiet work. He sat, and Madame Maigret poured him a little more wine, and they didn't speak because there was nothing to add that would make the city behave more decently than it intended. The window held. The draught went looking for a door, and somewhere on Rue du Chevaleret, in a room that had been a corridor and had remembered itself, a small triangle of glass kept a recipe exactly where it ought to be. 2 days later, the weather turned soft, as if Paris had been talked out of its sulks. The pavements were the color of pewter rubbed with a cloth. A wind moved that didn't choose sides. Maigret walked to the Quai des Orfèvres without thinking of cases, only of the way the river smelt faintly of rope and wet flour when barges nosed past. On his desk sat an unremarkable parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Lucas had set his pipe stem across it as if to keep it from escaping. "It came by hand," Lucas said. "A woman who looked like a woman, not a message. She said you would recognize the handwriting on the note, and if you didn't, the contents would do the talking." The note was the briefest courtesy. "For your coffee. For your patience. East Villard." The handwriting was square and careful, letters that were built rather than written. Beneath the paper lay a small tart in a tin mold, the surface lacquered with apricot, and the edge crimped with the exactness of a man who once made window frames and taught his wife to press her thumbs at even distances. Maigret smiled without moving the rest of his face and said nothing that would let Lucas have a jest. Later, when he had eaten a slice with a spoon because knives were at home, he put the empty mold on the windowsill of his office and set the triangle of glass inside it like a badge. Thin, bright, sufficient. Work came and went. A thief returned a bicycle to the wrong address and asked to be thanked. A woman insisted her neighbor's radio was tuned to immorality. Lognon brought in a rumor, and the weather with the same expression, nothing that required more than patience. Toward noon he walked down to Rue du Chevaleret, not to inspect, only to see how the street wore its every day again. The boy called headlines to men who had money for bread but not for scandal, and made a little show of selling Maigret a paper as if he were doing him a favor. At number 14, the glass held the winter light with the modest pride of a new tooth. On the sill sat a saucer with 2 green leaves in water, not parsley this time, something with a stiffer spine. He didn't go up. He stood on the opposite pavement long enough to see that the window had learned again to be a thing you don't look at unless you need to see the weather. At the ironmonger's, Bousquet complained that the cold made nails forget their jobs and winked in a way that pretended not to be approval. "Your widow bought a screw for a hinge," he said, making it a kind of benediction. "She chose well. There are people who know the weight of a small thing in the hand." At the linen shop 3 streets over, Madame le Maire was measuring a length of ribbon for a girl with red ears who wanted to make her Sunday dress look like someone else's. Monsieur le Maire stood behind the counter with his palms resting on the wood, shoulders set in that new alignment that wasn't apology and wasn't bravado. It was simply where a man stands when he has chosen his corner and discovered it fits him. When he saw Maigret, he nodded as men nod at markets to other men who have also come early enough to choose the good peaches. Nothing passed between them but recognition that a door had been closed and the house had grown warmer. On the way back, he crossed the bridge and paused in the wind where the city's voice comes up through the stones. There was no one under the arch. A cart went by above with its bells uncovered, democratic in their chatter. For a moment, because habit is the city's other weather, he looked for the long coat that disliked to arrive anywhere. He didn't see it. He imagined the man adjusting the air at another crack, pleased with his exactness, telling himself he kept people safe by arranging how they disobeyed. Paris has work for such men. It also has a way of tiring of them. It wasn't his business today. Back at the office, Lucas had found his pencil in his own pocket and was indignant with gratitude. "The post from the sector came," he said. "They'll leave your street alone unless the window asks to be spoken to." "Good," Maigret said. He wrote a line for the file because the file wanted feeding. Glazier paid by A.L. Balance settled by the other. Boy returned to papers. Jolivet keeps to bells. No further circulation of private weather through public air. He closed it and slid it into the drawer where the solved things go to learn to be forgettable. In the afternoon, Madame Villard herself climbed the stairs to the Quai des Orfèvres and arrived at his door with the dignity of a woman who has decided she will manage her errand with or without the building's help. She wore her good cardigan and a tighter bun than before. She didn't sit until he nodded, and even then she sat on the edge as if she might need to leave with the same neatness she had entered. "You received it," she said, glancing at the empty mold. "It was perfect," he said, which pleased her without making her blush. She folded her hands, looked at them, and then said the thing she had come to say. "When I wrote to you, I didn't know if I wanted you to stop it or to tell me it would stop by itself. I realized the second night after you came that I wanted the fault to have a name, not a person's name, a thing's. I wanted to say, it is the window, not it is me." "And is it the window?" he asked. "It is the window," she said very simply, "and it is mended." They sat quietly a moment with that. Outside, a tram rang its bell twice, as if asking and answering its own question. She stood. "I kept the cloth," she said at the door, as if confessing a superstition and defying it at once. "It will keep for dusting," he said. She smiled in a way that admitted he had made a joke. Then she went, and the room, after her, had the clean outline of a thing that has owed someone an answer and paid it. Evening slid down the walls of the city without bothering the lamps. He walked home slower than usual, not because he was tired, but because the day didn't require him to hurry. Near his building, Jolivet was coaxing a lame wheel past a rut with the patient malice men reserve for inanimate objects that pretend to have free will. He tipped his cap to Maigret and said, "If you hear of any glass that wants to travel at a decent hour, send it my way." It was his way of saying he had heard that the bells could ring naked again. At home, the kitchen held its reliable warmth. Madame Maigret had set the triangular shard of glass on a folded recipe of her own, bœuf à la mode in her hand, not his, and anchored the opposite corner with the salt cellar as if to divide the duties fairly. "Your widow?" she asked. "She is someone's neighbor again," he said, taking off his coat. "She has gone back to the size of her life." "And you?" she said. "I'm a man who eats his dinner," he said, which earned him an approving sniff that was mostly the gravy. Afterward, he walked to the little cafe where the proprietor knows how to leave a man alone with a full glass and a clean table. He took his usual place by the flawed pane that makes the street bulge and thin like a breath being remembered. Outside, a couple argued in whispers with their hands. A dog refused to come along without a performance. A woman in a green scarf laughed once and then became serious again for reasons the window could not know. He thought of the tall man and his pretended invisibility, the boy learning the price of his hands. Lemaire sanding the roughness off the back step until it agreed with feet, the widow choosing to sleep through a draft that was now honest, enough to use the door. He thought of how much of police work is not law but weather, where to stand, when to wait, which window to let be a window and which to scold into a door. When he left, the air had the taste of metal that belongs only to certain nights. He did not light his pipe until he reached the bridge. He cupped the match with a palm, and the flame showed him the scarred skin across his knuckles, from some old drawer that had objected to being forced. The ember took and glowed, the sort of red that makes a man feel briefly at the center of his own breath. He leaned on the rail and watched the river do its work, taking the city's small confessions and making them look like nothing at all. On the far bank a lamp trembled in a window, tiny and sure. It showed him nothing he hadn't seen, and that was its gift. He turned for home, and at the building door he felt for the draft out of habit. It was there, thin and decent, doing what drafts do, telling the air to mind its business. Upstairs, the kitchen window fogged a little at the edges. In the circle he wiped with his sleeve, he saw nothing in particular and was content with that. He sat, and Madame Maigret poured him a small glass, and they spoke of what one speaks of when there is nothing pressing, the market, a cousin's postcard, the way the coal delivered today was somehow lighter than last year's coal, which is impossible and true. Before bed he took the triangle from his pocket, not the widow's, his own, the one that had arrived in an envelope, and set it on the folded newspaper to keep the page he meant to finish in the morning. It caught the light and returned it without dramatics. He liked that. He turned down the lamp, and the room accepted the dark as if it had been expecting it. The city breathed, in through doors, out through chimneys, along corridors that were no longer windows, and he let sleep come the way he lets answers come when they are ready. Without reach, without hurry, with the certainty that if a pane goes missing, there will be wood enough and patience enough to set it right again, 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 set it right again.